I want to talk about some myths that I'm certain that all of you are aware of and give context to. And these are the myths of the Caucasians, the Aryans, and how Greek statues are used as a tool for white supremacy. Now, everyone here knows the Caucasian is nonsense, and I'm sure some of you know how it came about, but aren't sure why any white person somehow is Caucasian, and is from this region shared by Russia, Georgia, Azerbaijan, and one other country's name I can't remember. But we know that white people did not come from this place as far as how we know them. And how did this come about? How did we come up with the name Caucasian? And it was coined by a man named Johann Friedrich Blumenbach, who was German. He was a German anthropologist, and he collected skulls. And at the time, in the 18th century, skull measurement was all the rage. This is how anthropologists determined different peoples and races, and this was the scientific basis, the junk scientific basis for scientific racism and how they classified race, and also the inferiority, how inferior one was to another, was based on these skull measurements. So Johann Blumenbach was from this school. When he died, he had about 245 skull fragments, and he even had 2 mummies, because that's just the kind of shit white people did. So he is actually more thorough and more scientific than his peers in the field. He actually measures them and does not allow any bias to influence the measurement to confirm some theory of some race being inferior. He's very diligent about the data and information, and he actually contradicts a lot of his peers. A lot of them at the time believed that different races had descended from different species of human, and this was a theory called polygenism. And he had set the record straight and agreed, some others had agreed as well, that we all came from one species, one humankind, the modern human, and this was monogenism. He actually railed against the idea that the diseased or the deformed were part of another species, which was a popular train of thought at the time that people had put forth. He also made it very clear that the reason why people's skin was different was simply because of climate. If you were in a hotter climate, the darker your skin would be over a millennia of time. It's that simple. He was very much against slavery. He did not like the idea of taking a small sample of certain people and applying it to a large sample of people. And he actually believed that each race is capable of achieving everything just as easily as the others, when it comes to intelligence or art, medicine, or what have you, that they were equally capable, despite the fact that everyone was using faulty scientific measurements for race. Now, he wrote a journal. It was called Of the Natural Variety of Mankind, and there were several issues, and he made his notes in these issues. And he had broken down the race category. At the time he had added Caucasian, he had 4. He had the Mongoloids, which were the Asiatic races. He had the Americans, which included indigenous people, which is very confusing. He had the Malays, which were Malaysians. And then he had the Ethiopians, which were the black people. Well, he comes across this Georgian skull at some point, and he has this skull, and he is just like, this is the most beautiful thing. It's so symmetrical. The cheekbones, it's just, I don't know. I just imagine he's like Hamlet, and he's talking to it in the dark like candlelight or whatever. But this skull is just perfect to him, and it belongs to a woman, and it came from Georgia. And he had heard through other travelers who had traveled to Georgia about the beauty of these Georgian women. You would not believe they had the purest, whitest skin and the perfect bone structure, and these were just the ideal humans. And so the information he gets kind of makes him think that this must have been a beautiful, perfect Georgian woman. This skull is obviously an example. Ignore the fact that the skull actually belonged to a sex slave in Moscow. In 1795, he decides that this belongs to the Caucasian race. We don't actually know why he decides it's Caucasian as opposed to Georgian, maybe because there's a Georgian in America. His notes don't really say. But we now have an ideal of beauty and race under the Caucasian umbrella. And this sort of gives white people an origin myth, right? Down the line, when white people fill out their census and mark Caucasian, you can say you came from somewhere. When in reality, you're not really related to those people at all, especially because Blumenbach's Grouping of Caucasian included Eastern Asia, Northern Africa, and even India. And I think we all know that none of those people look white. Yet, and still, this is what Caucasian is. In another part of the world, there's a man named William Jones. And William Jones is a Supreme Court judge in India. India is ruled by the British at this time in the 18th century. And he decides that he wants to learn Sanskrit, despite the fact that Sanskrit is a sacred, holy language and is forbidden to teach Sanskrit to foreigners. Well, he had mastered dozens of languages by this time and would pretty much start the study of language or the interest in the study of languages. And he was a powerful white man in an all-brown country, and so no silly rule was going to stop him from doing whatever the hell he wanted. So he found someone to teach him Sanskrit and paid him, and as he studied Sanskrit, he realizes that this language is very much like European languages and also languages in Iran and East Asia, and he realizes, or decides rather, that it must have come from the same language. And so in 1786, he gives a speech and he talks about this Indo-European, which is the name they settle on, language that must have existed in this area as people spread out to other continents. Later on, as people are studying the text, they find a word that refers to a people, and the word is Aryan. And they realize that maybe the language is Aryan. Aryan was only meant to apply to the language of the Indo-European people. It was never a people, and it was never a race, ever. What the Sanskrit texts were most likely referring to are the status, the social status of these people, and how it translates in India down the line is noble, is what Aryan translates to. Well, this does not stop people from creating the myth of an Aryan people, especially one supreme asshole named Arthur de Gobineau, who is a Frenchman, and puts forth a theory that takes racial science to its most extreme unscientific proportions and declares that the Aryan people were the original rulers and master race, and that the only reason that they do not exist is because of race mixing, in which they spread out throughout the continents, but that the purest line can be traced back to the Germanic tribes and now the people of Germany. Now, we know where this is going. A man named Hitler then decides to adopt a spiritual Indian Sanskrit symbol called the swastika, which they still use to this day. The swastika is a good luck symbol, but Hitler and the Nazis decide to use it as an emblem of the master Aryan race, which would ruin it for everyone in the West from that point on. But the fever pitch of the Aryan race myth doesn't actually happen during the Nazis, because a lot of scientists said this doesn't make any sense, so they didn't lean too heavily on it. When they leaned heavily on it was the resurgence of the neo-Nazis. And the neo-Nazis, one of their favorite tools to support the idea of white supremacy as an example of the pure beauty of whiteness as the norm, were Greek statues. So now we have to jump to another Johann, another German. His name is Johann Winckelmann. He is the father of art history, some refer to him as, and he was in love with Greek art, and he thought it was the most pure, the most beautiful, specifically the statues. And he, as a man who loved men, felt that the male form was the primary vehicle of the beauty of mankind. He wasn't much a fan of the female form in the realm of art. And so he pretty much extols these pure white marble Greek statues as the standard of beauty. This is the most beauty you could get. There was only one problem with this, and that's that the Greek statues were never white. The Greeks would have been baffled had you come to them and told them they are a race of people that is a color. So, especially since a lot of them range from bronze to deep brown. So it's really no surprise that the statues were actually painted floridly in the clothing and different skin tones on the face. They were painted from head to toe. They were never, ever white. The evidence that the Greeks believed that darker skin, specifically on men, was more attractive and more desired, possibly because it meant that you worked outside and you were a warrior or you were a big badass who did things. Not so for women. For women, it was the more pale skin because it meant that you could stay indoors and had a leisurely life. So not a lot has changed. Now, what Winckelmann was actually extolling and loved so much were Italian copies of Greek statues. It's very possible that the Italians excavated these statues and they were flecks of color that had not survived due to specifically the climate and just made them white. But because of Winckelmann, all the statues that were uncovered during his time and after that showed signs of color had been erased. They were wiped clean, they were scrubbed. They were to be made as white, as pure white as possible, despite them never having been intended to be so. So we then arrive at this beauty ideal of this really pure white color that is unattainable for pretty much most of humanity. And it actually rules most everyone in the world ineligible of attraction and beauty, because I think we're all aware most of the world is brown. So this not only is a tool for white supremacy for the minority of whites in the world in a Eurocentric view, it's also a literal tool for white supremacists. The neo-Nazis who had bought into the Aryan myth also used the classical Greek white statues as the example and the reasoning of whiteness as a culture and as a color, despite the fact that that whiteness never, ever existed. So we have the myth of Caucasian, we have the myth of Aryan, and we have these Greek white statues. And the prompt, the question, the digging that we do is, what in you, whether you are black or white, what is the Greek white statue that you still find yourself reaching for in this day and age? What is the mythic ideal handed to you by white supremacy and European thought, whether it be behavior or beauty, that you still find yourself trying to attain in your daily life in order to survive in this white supremacist society? That is the question. And also, if you can name it and find it, can you destroy it? And that's it.